Thank you all. Can everybody hear me back there? Yes, excellent. I am very excited that I'm here. I'm very much inspired by everybody in this room, in this conference. I've been told by my partners, you shouldn't be nervous. All they want is a little inspiration, but honestly, I feel like totally inspired by everyone. I'm not sure I'll be able to inspire you even more. I'm right there with everybody who feels like this coming into communion is a critical part of our work. It reconnects us to the people and the values that give us the strength to move forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, where it is I find hope, how it is I am inspired to do the work I am. There are obvious things in this, of course, right? But there are other things that might not be so obvious and that I found throughout my career that they just keep me going when things might not seem clear. Speaking of things that might not seem clear, I'll ask your patience if I just start sharing a bunch of ideas here that don't seem to go anywhere in particular. This is my first keynote, and so I am trying it all out here with you. I hope that by the end of it, some of those ideas will be clear, and if anything is left unclear, feel free to ask me. I usually give very short presentations, so I'm expecting lots of time for a Q&A. So that's basically it. I am going to be talking about something that's very dear to my heart. When I think about conservation, it's always big scale. It's the one thing that attracted me to my current job at Wildlands Network, even before, many years before I worked at Wildlands Network. The whole concept of we can save little pieces of it. It has to be the whole thing. And the whole thing is what makes sense. And how do you make it work? When we've got all these disparate cultures, points of views, interests, etc., etc., etc. And I keep banging my head with struggling with that notion. What I'm going to present is not a roadmap to that, not a given solution, not a full theory of it. Maybe it's just a bunch of assorted insights that I've been having through my career and sharing them with you in the spirit of sharing it all out, in the spirit of communion, of bringing what I have to bring, ideas to be tossed around and shared. That's all that's there, that's in it. And so this is where I want to start, with a Canadian author that probably all are familiar with. And Margaret Atwood wrote this short story. I won't spoil it to you, but there are Martians that come to planet Earth and they want to see a musical in New York, right? But they land in Canada. And so they are a little confused about their whereabouts, and they find somebody who's kind enough to tell them that they are in Canada, which is a different country. This somebody is a mushroom of the Amanita muscaria species. Luckily enough, the Martians, as her illustration shows, were similar enough that they could understand each other. And they asked the mushroom, like, we're in a different what? A different country. Well, what is a country? And Margaret Atwood takes this opportunity, and you'll excuse me if I read it, because there's no way I'm improving on Margaret Atwood's writing, and I'm not paraphrasing her. A country, says Atwood's mushroom, is an idea people get into their brains. Draw a line, you put up walls and gates and such. You say some people can't come in and other people can't go out. You say everything inside this country is a certain kind of thing, and that's how it is done inside the line you draw. You make laws, you have customs and a language, 2 languages, or 54 languages. It depends. You see, the details for each country vary, but the concept is a country is an idea. And once we accept that, we can tinker with that idea and try and figure out what it is exactly that we want to do with this idea. One of the things that I do with this idea is ask myself, are they necessary? Is this an idea that we will always have? At first glance, when you think about North America, countries seem immovable. They've been there for all of our lives, all of our parents' lives, all of our grandparents' lives. They're probably not going anywhere. They seem like they can only be changed by huge, massive forces of history and war. Just not us, right? They're just random people. No? So maybe we start looking at this from a different perspective. And the mushrooms are helpful here because mushrooms have a long memory. For the largest part of human history, there was absolutely no need for that. I'm talking about 300,000 years of us being, more or less currently us. Lines are busted when it comes to evolution. But throughout most of that, there were simply no countries. It was all a single landscape. It was connected. If you accept that we are animals, we're just a mammal in this planet. You look at the rest of the animals around us. Do they have countries? Not really, Some of them might have territories for an individual or a group. They don't draw hard lines on the ground. They might mark it here and there in some very, very subtle way that sometimes even only members of their own species will identify. Other than that, they have no use for countries. So from an evolutionary perspective, countries are very novel, very atypical of mammals. So, do we actually need them? The thing is, once you start creating countries, a natural tension arises between our urge to move and the inherent nature of countries, which is to keep us in place. And then that becomes problematic. And I find it especially ironic how some of our country myths are built. Anybody recognize what this might be about? Even familiar with this, other than a couple of people I've already talked to? Oh, interesting. It's de Mexico. Okay. So you won't let me lie here. Every Mexican grows with the origin story of how the mighty Aztecs traveled from the mythical land of Aztlan, and they were looking for the divine sign that would tell them where they would settle and create this new city that would be grand and glorious. And the symbol would be a golden eagle perched upon a prickly pear eating a rat. A little random, but nice that they threw in some wild animal. Eventually, after a very long migration from wherever this Aztlan is, because historians don't really agree on where that might be, they landed on what is now the Central Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City evolved. And they found the symbol they were looking for on an island in the middle of a lake. And that's where they established the city of Tenochtitlan. And Tenochtitlan, of course, later became Mexico City and the center of Mexican culture. That is our origin story in Mexico. Some of you grew with this origin story. A bunch of people came in the Mayflower, landed in Plymouth Rock, and started a colonization process that resulted in modern United States. So, putting aside how controversial country building is when you start out with imperialistic Aztecs or colonial Europeans, I find it especially ironic that we use these myths of movement, of migration, to stop people from moving and to stop animals from moving. It is like we recognize that this is a part that is virtuous about us as human beings, as societies. We move, we migrate, we face great personal hardship because we have this idea that somewhere else might be better. It's just an idea, just like a country. It's not tangible, it's not there, but that idea pushes millions and millions of people to move constantly. Of course, not just people. The same idea is somehow ingrained in animals. They also move by the millions. Ahiga, my friend here, was the other day saying, movement is life. If you don't move, you die. That's basically it. That thing is absolutely ingrained on us. and animals as well. This propelling energy behind all these myths is a super powerful concept, you know? It's not surprising that it creates all of these myths. It is as much an animal instinct as it is a human instinct. We all need to move. One might argue, well, it's ingrained in animals' genes, but it's really more of a cultural thing for people. It's more in our needs. I don't think that's true. I wouldn't be surprised if scientists at some point found, you know, the gene that makes us migrate. Of course, I'm joking. We all know no single gene will control complex behavior in any animal, whatever. But it is what it is. We are a moving species. We definitely need to move. It's an almost supernatural force that compels us to continue to move, to migrate, to go from one place to another. It shapes everything around us. It shapes our personal lives, it shapes our societies, and eventually shapes the landscape around us, how we move through it. Then why are we so fixated on establishing borders? If borders literally represent death. Would it not make more sense to embrace the fluidity of wildlife and people, to accept that borders are futile, temporary? They've only been around for, you know, a few thousand years at best. So they're probably not absolutely necessary. It might be best, I think, to accept that every landscape has to allow for the flow of life through it. Whatever that flow of life looks like. It might be wildlife, it might be people, it might be water. We definitely need all that. We need to consider this option. And some people probably considered it. For the longest time in the history of this continent, where it was already inhabited, people had territories. And I'm sure they had territory squabbles and fights, and they probably didn't agree on everything, but they didn't have hard borders. That was not necessary. These were soft borders that changed over time. People were migrating from one place to another. There were seasonal shifts. They were sharing of resources between all the different cultures. And what impacts me about this map, created by that Native Land Digital, an organization in Canada, is that all these native territories, admitting this is a false snapshot of a moment in history that never actually existed. You know, this is a composite of multiple times throughout history where all these native territories might have been, or more or less were. And so what impresses me is the diversity of this. And yet, animals were capable of moving from one place to another undeterred. People were capable of moving from one place to another undeterred. They didn't have to cross all these individual borders every time they were crossing territories. And so this makes me think, you know, this might be a probable answer to reconnecting the continent. Only in the many, the whole. For those of you who are familiar with Taoism, you might recognize that duality of life. That duality of life was very important. So, I didn't expect this. This is a very important person to me that lived her life in this state and needed it. I don't think I've fully come to terms with her passing. And my daughter is named after her. And my philosophy of life is in many ways influenced by her. For those of you who know her, she wrote about this duality of life, of everything that surrounds us. Only in the many, the whole, something that came to me. But it came to me, of course, from her inspiration. This is a creation myth that she brought about. The creation of a fantastical world that she made. Only in silence the word. Only in dark the light. Bright hawk's flight of the empty sky. She understood that you need this apparent opposites to make things whole, to make things happen. Those opposites are creative forces. And in the same manner, I think that only by recognizing the absolute diversity of everything we have here, the diversity of life, the diversity of cultures, approaches, legal systems, all of that, will we eventually reconcile this continent and have a single continent. In opposition to this, of course, there's an imposition of divisiveness, because some people think this part of the world has to be homogeneous. We all speak this language, we all look this way, we all act this way. There's no room for diversity. This is the food you eat, this is the TV you watch, these are the books you read. And see how what would be apparently a binding force is actually a dividing force. The resurgence of nationalism's ugly visage has created no shortage of suffering, whether it's separation of families in the US border or the destruction of the Selva Maya, the Maya forest, and the border between Sonora and Arizona. Because of these nationalistic projects that have more of an agenda of, we want to push this single way of being, and everybody has to accept it, and see how much destruction they bring about. This is the US-Mexico border. And I will spend some time talking about the devastation it is causing and how it has cultural ramifications that some of you may not be aware. Some of you might be a little more informed and know that it is blocking corridors for wildlife. There are other impacts in the conservation field, for sure. The history of this border wall is older than the Trump administration. It was made possible through the passage in 2005 of the Real ID Act. The Real ID Act, checking my notes to get it right, increased the burdens on asylum seekers, which is a bit revealing of the true racist nature of this bill. It allowed for the waiving of any laws that might interfere with the construction of border barriers. The very passing of the act created a split in the United States. Everything a certain distance removed from the border was America, where we respect the rule of law. Everything closer to the border, anything goes. It's no man's land. You want to construct a wall there, you go ahead and construct. You want to ditch environmental laws, just ditch them. You know, Antiquities Act, you don't need that to build a wall. Just toss it away. There's a part of America that's governed by the rule of law. There's a border fence. A lot of what is said about the border focuses, and rightly so, on the inhumanity of it. The wall is a brutal manifestation of one of the US's worst schemes. It's racist. It is a barrier against the brownness of us Mexicans and other Latin American people. But the hate against my people, like all other flavors of hate, is incapable of being self-contained. No matter how narrowly targeted they tell you it is, hate will always spill over and cause all manner of collateral damage. In this case, the damage is manifest in the severance of wildlife habitat and ancient migration routes, the ravaging of the landscape, the very alteration of the evolutionary history of this region. Animals will struggle to adapt to this barrier. Some might succeed, but others certainly won't. This is a part of the border wall some people not often see. These are techniques used in open pit mining that have been used to blast hills so that somebody can build a wall, because that's what the contract says. Never mind that the hill is a much more formidable barrier for any potential migrants. You just want to destroy the hill for the sake of building the wall. Some animals make it through some portions of the wall. Others won't. It just won't be able. There's already divided populations of Sonora pronghorn that may never see their relatives. And in the meantime, it will not only continue to obstruct the natural flows of life, it also taints the relationship between our countries. Does that look like a friendly neighborhood? It really doesn't, right? It is no coincidence that around the time the construction of the first segments of wall came up in the Bush administration, U.S. agency officials that used to travel often into my home state of Sonora suddenly found their permits not coming through. They wanted to come to Mexico, collaborate with Mexican conservationists on totally non-threatening things. We want to protect this toad, this frog, that salamander. Nope, permits not coming. All of this was playing out just as one of the most ambitious and inspiring binational collaborations was taking place. The conservation of the borderlands jaguars. In the late 90s, 2 lion hunters of Arizona and New Mexico found jaguars in the borderlands. And they both did something unique. Set down their gun, pulled out a camera, took some pictures. The trickle effect of what these two people did was that a whole conservation movement was created around this population of jaguars. It uprooted complete lives, including my own. I was living in Mexico City, where I grew up, in a part of town that's called Xochimilco, the town of flowers, lots of water, used to be all lakes. And then suddenly I found myself in Sonora, the Sonoran Desert, very arid, trying to protect these jaguars and establish a reserve for them. It was, I think, one of the most rewarding projects because there was a binational collaboration from the start. It was Mexican staff, there were US partners who contributed mostly in the form of funding, but they also brought in ideas and they had they provide a lot of leadership in those early stages about, how should this develop? Those partners are still heavily engaged in the protection of this habitat. And it sucks, I have to say it sucks, that just as binational collaboration was growing between the NGOs, we could not get the agencies to come often enough to Mexico because, the whole thing had changed. This is a place. They're smarter, of course. And this is a little of the region. The Northern Jaguar Reserve is over there where that purple blob is. And those are the corridors that allow jaguars to go south into Sinaloa and north into Arizona and New Mexico. The border wall has almost closed those corridors. The chances of jaguars returning naturally to Arizona and Sonora are very, very, very small. More so since from the time when we started our project to now, there's been increased understanding of how they disperse. And by now, scientists are pretty certain that females don't move that far away from their native grounds. It's males that are exploring mostly the borderlands. One day, a female might establish herself in Arizona. That's the hope, right? But because it looks so difficult to establish a population of jaguars naturally in the US, there are numerous partners calling for, let's talk about reintroduction of jaguars into the United States. And I can't help but wonder, as noble as the end goal is, what would it say about the colonial tendencies of the United States if it were to helicopter a bunch of jaguars from Latin America into the United States, ignoring the fact that there is a wall that separates our countries? Can Mexico in good conscience support such an effort? When it is clear that if the real purpose were to redress the failures of the past and restore the ecological gap that jaguars left in the United States when they were hunted out of this country, then the destruction of a unilaterally built border wall should be a prerequisite for all collaboration. Those are the implications of having that border wall. Will we fall in the trap of recovering a species in a wealthy country while ignoring the destruction across an arbitrarily drawn line? Or worse yet, at the expense of jaguar populations in Mexico? I know the conservationist colleagues of mine who are putting this idea forth. They're not colonialists minded. They're not thinking about it this way. They want to restore the integrity of the ecosystems in the United States. But the border wall changes all that. The conversation has shifted. The reality of things is that we can't think about these landscapes in an isolated manner. This is not about recovering jaguars in the United States. This is about recovering continental integrity for jaguars and other species. That is the main question. I have to caution that unilateral imposition of an artificial barrier between our landscapes has changed inherently the game of international collaboration, and it will continue to do so. It doesn't mean that we are totally resenting it and we won't collaborate. It just taints the relationship. It doesn't feel friendly to be talking about these things in the presence of this massive thing. Now, hopefully, jaguars will eventually make their way back to the United States. I still hope that's the case. It is easy to lose hope when you talk about the border. It's easy to feel small, like this little guy. Can't get hope, right? And so we have to look for hope somewhere. And the antidote I find most effective against hopelessness. Dramatic pause. Is the exercise of imagination. Some of you may have already guessed that I am a fan of science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction. I think this art form is absolutely necessary for comprehending reality, and better yet, for imagining different realities. Imagining different realities is one of the most generative forces in the world. So rather than despair about the border wall and its impact on jaguar recovery in the US, let me offer this alternative. For the next decade or two, we dedicate collective funding and efforts to increase protections of jaguar habitat in Mexico, while investing in coexistence mechanisms that reduce the threat posed by ranchers hunting. We do so while we continue an effort to dismantle the border wall, while we wait for its eventual and inevitable dismantling. Because make no mistake, this wall will also fall. This is a graffiti in a wall in Palestine. I would love for the border wall to fall within my life. That might not happen, but I am absolutely certain that it will fall. And it is very likely that some of the people who will see it fall are already new. There's lots of them. Furthermore, if we imagine this borderless, this wall-less landscape, borderless landscape in the Sky Islands of Sonora and Arizona, we can start thinking about those kinds of collaborations, you know, where we're investing together in protecting the resources where they currently are and removing the barriers for them to expand naturally. And that will bring about the goodwill that we need for our nations to collaborate. If the US starts supporting conservation in Mexico to the point where the jaguars thrive and are naturally reaching the border and heading back, then, Mexico will feel a lot more compelled to assist any recovery effort in the US. That's absolutely necessary. And furthermore, once they do, two countries will already be collaborating, such that when a jaguar crosses the border, there will be constant monitoring of those animals, ensuring that they have safe spaces across the border. As we imagine these different realities that I've just placed on your minds, I am also reminded that science fiction does something else. It creates these alternate realities, but you don't pull it out of yourself. It is based on something. It is based on science. And it suddenly struck me, a lot of what we do as conservationists is science fiction. We do the science, then we tell the story. We tell the story of a fiction that doesn't exist. It's not reality. The borderless country that I just told you about is not reality. But I'm here creating that reality for you, telling you that story. It is based on science. Yeah, science tells us for the longest time in our evolutionary history, we have no need for countries. That's the science. How do we craft the science to create these compelling stories? And that's all we do eventually. Whether it's telling people don't build a road here, it's not good, or it's don't have so many cows on the landscape, it's not good for your landscape or your cows. And this is based in science. I am very much encouraged by how now it's not just science, just like the great artists in science fiction create not just from science, but also from traditional learning and from lived experience to create a really compelling science fiction story. I think we as conservationists need to do exactly the same. We take the science, we take the native people's learnings, and we craft a story that resonates with us personally, such that we can convince others that this reality is possible and that they should be investing in it. These pictures are from a project that was also very important in my formative years as a conservationist. These are the Yaqui people in the Bacatete area. It's one of the only territories that Mexico left for its native indigenous people in the form of a territory, something that you could recognize here as a reservation. The rest of them were called ejidos. They're an agrarian structure, and you will conform to agrarian and ranching expectations. Not so the Yaqui territory. The Yaqui were feisty. They fought and fought and fought against the imposition of the Mexican nation state. And eventually, the government of Mexico decided, not worth it. Let's tell them this is their territory and we won't mess with it. Good for them. The Yaqui people are still protecting the Bacatete. There's a population of jaguars that's probably moving about. We provided a little bit of the science. We trained them on the use of camera traps. We learned from their elders, like the man in the picture, Don Miguel. And it was really gratifying bringing all these things together. In the end, the Yaqui had other priorities. Conservation didn't look so important to them at that time. And we respected them. And we stepped back. And we were letting them deal with their issues, however they see fit. But I learned something. That there was a huge, great story to tell if you could only bring together the science, the traditional knowledge, the lived experience of having spent days and days and days with these people in the Sierra Bacatete. Then I could tell an interesting story. And so, as we ask people to imagine these things, I find that a lot of them, all that they lack is imagination. Sure. I'm sure there are evil people trying to get more border wall constructed, but that's not the majority of the people we confront with conservation. The majority of people we confront with lack imagination. They have not imagined a world where the fence shouldn't go there, the development shouldn't go there, etc., etc. And so, if you realize it's about sharing the stories, it's about coming together. It's about creating this connection between people and landscape and wildlife, corridors. Well, maybe that's the way we create, something that is significant at the continental scale. I find that the most engaging actions to combat apathy are not those that involve national leaders, but those that occur among common people. These kinds of things. My work with the Yaqui, my work with in the Northern Jaguars, all those things, my current work trying to protect the Costa River, all those things come about because we're having all of these random meetings, all of these communion little pieces of things that might seem unimportant, certainly not newsworthy most of the time. And yet, they are super, super important in my opinion. They are mundane acts of resistance against nationalism, against homogenizing everything, against absorbing a single culture. The more so if we force ourselves to connect with people who are different, who speak a different language. If we make the effort to learn that language, I think it becomes really rewarding. Coming together in communion to share these stories, to break bread, or tortillas, and to figure out ways to reconnect the landscapes, not by erasing our differences, but by honoring them, embracing them, to create a path forward that has all these perspectives together. And here's where I find the most helpful way of bringing together conservation and multiculturalism. This is something that I think has become more and more important to our world, because we have to acknowledge that habitat connectivity and cultural connectivity are fundamentally intertwined. They both have the roots in the need for all species to move from one place to another. And humans, wherever they move, they bring their pesky cultures. You know, they bring their tacos, they bring their music, they bring salsa. And guess what? People enjoy that. It opens up a doorway for communion, for understanding, for collaboration. And if we start looking at these simple acts of breaking bread or tortillas with the people in our communities and the people in other communities as acts of resistance, we see ourselves not so much as conservationists in the sense that we want to conserve and maintain a status quo. And that's something that's been bothering us for a while. It's not about conserving. It's about showing a path forward. The past is the past. We're never going to get it back. It's never going to look exactly the same. We can take certainly a lot of inspiration from it. We should learn a lot from the past, but we should not conserve the past. We cannot do that. We have to rethink what we call our path of conservation. Do we really want to call it conservation? Or is it more of an evolution? I'm not sure. I don't have a solution to that. I don't come here to come up with a new term and show it to you and lead me all to this new movement that we're calling this or that. Just want us all to reflect collectively. You know, when we talk about conservation, we have to think it more in terms of a generative force that changes things but connects people. Because if we do not connect people, then people will continue to trash all the things that we love. A lot of the work involves, yes, the species, yes, the landscapes, etc., etc. Most of the work, let's be honest, it involves people. So the call to diversify our movement must not be seen as a trend to attract more supporters, to satisfy the donor that is asking us about our diversity policy. That's not it. It is an existential need of the conservation movement to diversify itself, or else it becomes meaningless, in my opinion. The science tells us that conservation in isolation of little pockets of landscape will not save us from the extinction crisis or the climate crisis that we're facing. So how do we connect large landscapes? Well, there's only one way I can see that we can do it. And that is bringing together all the different peoples who live on those landscapes and try and understand them and try and bring them together in a way that makes sense to all of them, not just to you. In this model of integrating multiculturalism into the conservation practice, we've been making some progress at Wildlands Net. I was hesitant about sharing this because you know what? We haven't figured it out. We don't have a solution. We certainly don't have a roadmap for anybody else that follows. But in the spirit of sharing half-baked ideas and things that, you know, may or may not accomplish our big and bold goal, I'm going to share a few of those things. And hopefully you'll give me some ideas how we can do better. Hopefully you'll find inspiration, like, what of that one in particular? Maybe we start doing a little bit of it. This is the origins of Wildlands Net. Some of you people recognize some of the faces there. Just there for a few minutes. You may want to see what that looks like.
That green dots over on the right.
Yes. Anybody else want to talk a name?
Dave Foreman in the
Dave
back.
Foreman right there. Rob Monge is right there. Michael Soleil is there. That's, you know, Wildlands Network. And I'm super grateful with all these white dudes for what they did. But you have to recognize this is our origin. This is our origin. And I knew some of these people in person. I was moved by Dave Foreman howling at the meetings. I was sad when Michael Soleil died. He told me once after a meeting something that I will always remember because it was so deeply moving that I thought that. I won't share it, it will sound like bragging, but it was just very personally important to have Michael Soleil approach you and tell you something that you remember years afterwards. And so this is just a quick snapshot, more or less what we look like. That's not all our staff. But I think we're finding a way to honor the dream of our founders, the dream they had of a connected North America. And the way we're finding is bringing people who think different, who look different, have different backgrounds. I am impressed by how many women there are in staff. I'm impressed by how many women there are in the conservation movement. I am impressed by how many women are in the nonprofit movement in general. And the same goes for Mexico. And recently, I felt very depressed. I realized we men were not doing the same effort. I felt for the same time what many of you women have felt many, many times. And I'm not begging for sympathy. Be horrible after what women face in the world. Women I love. That you're less because of your gender. I felt that for the first time when I realized how much making this world a better world is in the hands of women, not men. I salute you. I thank you. And I swear to you, I'll do better in inspiring more men to take on the mantle of making this world better in many, many ways. Because only so this is all very inspirational. How do you ground it? How do you make it happen? The way you ground it is you figure out what each of these different smaller regions, remember the territory of the native peoples of North America, and think, if we were to think about those smaller territories and how they all fit together, and we look closely at those territories, and we realize, you know what? We have to figure out how to heal this small part of the whole. We cannot simply expect a recipe of wild conservation across all of North America to work everywhere. That's never ever going to happen. That's nationalism with a different name. What we have to do is come into communion with the people who live on each of these small sections of the whole and try and heal what they know is wrong. and try and support them in whatever way we can to reconnect the peace that they see. Knowing, of course, from the vantage point of a continental connectivity organization, that whatever it is we do in this particular spot is going to be meaningful at the large scale. We don't fret too much about it. Focus on the small ones. Like ocelots. We talk a lot about jaguars, but ocelots are smaller and clearer sometimes. So this is one of the projects that we're thinking. Creating in one of the corridors that jaguars use ever so often to get into the United States, a system of private lands protections that benefits both these wildcats and the ranchers that manage those lands. And that are, you know, as much as sometimes we get in conflict with ranchers, they're better than miners. That's better than agriculture. So we want to keep these ranchers in business in this particular area, or else they're forced to sell to mining industries, or else they're forced to sell to agriculture. And then the landscape that they were poorly sometimes better, sometimes sharing with these wildcats, nobody else is sharing these wildcats. So we're trying to do this, and guess what? The northernmost breeding population of ocelots lives here. How cool is that? Do we want to protect them? Yes, we want to protect them. Even if only every 5 years we see a jaguar again. If it's only a transient corridor for them. What the landscape needs is a bunch of breeding ocelots, and that's what we're going to try and do. We also work on the border. We're ground truthing and advocating for the removal of the border. Our staff in Tucson has conducted the most comprehensive survey of the border wall. And you can check it out here. bit.ly border wall story map. Anybody wants to write that down on that slide? That story map tells the whole story, but it also gives you access to a map that's constantly updated, where you can see exactly what sections are built, where they are built, and when they were built. This information we found was lacking. There are many people who are fighting against the border wall. And we thought, we're not going to do the same. We're never going to be as visible as some of the people in this room who do great, valuable campaigns. We're not going to compete with them. It doesn't make any sense. You know, what are they lacking? Oh, nobody has done this. Nobody knows exactly where it ends. Nobody knows which sections were built in the Bush administration. So these guys need technical advice. You know, that's what we're going to provide. And we still provide it. We also use our technical expertise to provide others with legal tools. And I thought this would be interesting for some of you. Since you guys are lawyers, this should be interesting to lawyers, of course. There's a little figure moving there. That's a wolf that was colored, called Sonora, released in Mexico. And you see what it means. The video will, so you'll have a chance to see it again. We got the data from the Mexican scientists who had colored this wolf, asked them nicely, and they gave it to us. And this information, along with other technical information, was provided to the states that filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration. Because if you remember, the Trump administration wanted to use the Department of Defense funds to build a wall. Some people were not happy with that. That's not what the money for Department of Defense is. And they filed a lawsuit. And we provided technical evidence in support of that. And guess what? You know, as much as the border wall was built, that money wasn't used to build. And so thank you for the people who filed a lawsuit, who saw it through fruition, and we're very glad to help with the technical assistance. We don't have to do everything ourselves. In the regions of New England and the maritime provinces of Canada, we have a project we call Future Forestry Net. It is centered around native management of forests. There's been people living there forever, basically. They know how to keep an old growth forest. And so we're bringing them together with foresters from both countries to come up with ideas of how we could do better in protecting old forests that exist now, but also, and this is super important, generating the old forests of the future. This is what excites me about this project. Not just the international collaboration, not just the indigenous participation, but the time scale in which we're thinking. This is a time scale that makes sense to me. It's like the people who are going to be the granddaughters of my granddaughter. Those are the people I want to do something about. In North Carolina, our science chief, Ron, has been working so hard to recover the red wolf. So thank you, Ron. It is an incredibly inspiring project. And this project is really amazing because the red wolves are stuck between roads on one side and a creeping coastline that, as climate change makes it harder and harder for them to find the land that they need, they're going to be pushed more and more onto the roads. And guess what? We also do road ecology, so we get a chance to support in that. And Ron has been leading the scientific effort that supports all the different groups that are in defense of the red wolf. Again, we don't have to do the same thing everywhere. This is what the red wolf needs. This is what we provide. In the Four Corners area, there's a big solar plant that is going to be built because the little smokes you might be able to see there on the horizon are coal plants that are going to be decommissioned really soon. And people are asking, what impact will this have on habitat connectivity? Well, we're going to try and answer this. We're working with government partners, agencies, and tribes to start surveying exactly what does this landscape look? Where do animals live? What should be areas where there's no solar? What are areas that they might have solar? You know, and that's a question that's going to be coming up again and again and again as we transition to renewable energy. In an ideal world, it would be every roof over already urbanized, already land changed land. That's not realistic. There's going to be places that are going to be sacrificed, and we want to make sure that we understand what we're losing and we can document it. Part of this project also supports a couple of positions within tribal agencies, and this is, again, what does the country need? What are people already there? And that's what we try and provide. In Utah, we're improving fences for wildlife. And just recently, the state approved $20 million for wildlife crossings through our advocates. And that is, I think, fantastic. So a big clap for you, that team. I should say Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, because one of our Utah leaders is jumping all over that landscape. Highway 395. This is in California. We're monitoring, with the help of great partners in Pathways for Wildlife, a number of drainages on this highway that goes from the corner of Nevada to Honey Lake to figure out, what wildlife is there, and are they using these drainages as wildlife crossings? Is it any different in the stretch of the road that has a fence from the stretch of the road that doesn't have it? And we're getting lots of interesting things. We never imagined we'd see a wolf crossing a drainage under a highway in California. To my knowledge, this is the only footage that exists of such an occurrence. The people who made this video possible are also in this room. So a big clap to get right here. If that doesn't make him famous, who here has seen a video of a coyote and a badger running under a neck? Same. And I left Oregon last, because I assume some of you probably live here. The recent past, you were very supportive of a bill which gave rise to Oregon's Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. We saw this is what Oregon does. Some legislative interventions. We don't need to bring camera traps. We don't need to protect wildcats from ranchers. What we need here, some legislative changes. We advocated for the legislators to set aside $7 million for Oregon Transportation Infrastructure Fund that will reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. Those things have already happened. That's what we've done here. We should be very proud. And there's people in this group who also participated in that, right, Erin?
And we do all volunteering. We wrote that.
Yay. And, you know, right now we're focusing on other things. There's a couple of other bills, very interesting, moving along, that we're advocating. Our new Oregon staff is supporting that. And I want to take a pause here because it is important to understand how these actions are again connected to the whole. It is not about this bill. This bill may pass or may not. The movement will continue to go forward. The connection of the continent will continue to move forward. And if there's somebody here who's interested in supporting the Oregon work in any manner, just think that if you reach towards us, you will also be supporting continental connectivity in a union. We're also noticing, you know, there's needs in the road ecologies. And these are not like in set of camera traps like in California. What we're seeing is these projects have to navigate a very complex labyrinth of regulations. This is no news to lawyers. But what we have is a very astute lawyer here in our Oregon who knows like, yeah, we'll do it this way so that we don't get in trouble with the EPA regulation or NEPA regulation or whatever it is you're facing. And so that is what we bring to the table here in Oregon. And this is kind of what it looks like when you put it all on a map. Small interventions here and there that build up over time. That's a future forest landscape over there, the huge block. There's a border wall. There's other projects that I didn't go into. We're here, we're there, as far south as Sinaloa, trying to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions with jaguars. In Baja California Sur, we're moving forward with the Balanga Natural Protected Area, trying to get it to recover money from the dues that people pay to enter it. It would seem obvious they have that money. They have to give it to the central federal government. They never see it. And so we're advocating for that as a way of doing that for other natural protected areas. So our work looks very different depending on where we are. We're not reinventing ourselves in every one of these landscapes. We're acknowledging the diverse necessities all of these different areas have, the people have there. We're adapting so that we can better serve them, and we continue to hold the big continental vision. And since I already quoted a Canadian author and a US author, I thought it pertinent to quote a Mexican author, Juan. And to end on a positive note, there's air and sun, there's clouds, up above a blue sky, and behind it, maybe there are songs, maybe better voices. In short, there's hope. There's hope for us against our sorrows. Thank you. Did I stick true to my promise? Sort of. We got 30 minutes for Q&A. Done? Super clear. Excellent. I'm going to vote. Yes, there's a question.
Do you do anything with Central American tapeworms?
No, right now, we don't go any farther south than Mexico. We've got interventions at the national state on policy issues. Our groundwork in Mexico is focused on Northwest Mexico, the states of Sonora, Chihuahua, Sinaloa, and Baja California. Yes. Over there.
I just want to say thank you. We've been to a lot of sessions in the last few days, and they, well, let me just say, sometimes I get stuck in the trees. Or in the grasslands, and you know, to offer us some vision and help. I'm very impressed with the work you're doing, because it does begin on the ground and it does begin one step at a time. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Wanted to add that to educate people, it's really good to say the importance of predators. You know the importance, but most people don't understand that they're the structural framework for a whole ecosystem. As well as predators travel so far, there's really no containing them, so they're the perfect thing, plus everybody loves them.
No, no. Yeah. Yes. But yes, there already exists a coalition of people who are trying to get grizzlies restored in Northwest United States, in Washington. And we are going to chat with them and see how we can help. And again, in the spirit of, we don't want to duplicate efforts. We don't want to tell people how to do something they're already doing. We're going to listen to them, figure out how best we can help. So, you know, maybe in a few years I can add grizzly bears to the mix here. Anyone else? Over there, yes.
I really appreciate your inspiring. I've done a lot of work on picture marks and I've been really impressed with the way Miles is documenting for and especially the way he did like real time data collection and sharing with the container law for our government. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about how that works with other folks doing that work. It's been extremely helpful.
Well, absolutely. Miles is an old school ecologist. I am constantly impressed by the work he puts into making this, into documenting the border wall. I'm gonna open it. Okay. And he approached it from a very naturalist perspective. Let's get the data, let's get it right. And that means doing the layer. So as important it is to be in Washington saying, don't build this monstrosity, it is also important to just, you know, don a hat and go out there in the sun and travel. Miles has walked this landscape again and again. He takes his drone with him and he documents all the portions of the wall that are being built. When the governor of Arizona decided that the federal government wasn't doing enough for the border wall, and he started putting these containers there, he was documenting that destruction, and not just destruction. That, again, that lawlessness, where the state of Arizona was encroaching on federal lands, deciding that this is what's needed because there's an emergency that needs to be averted because there's 6 billion people crossing the border. That was someone else, right? Evidently, that's not the case. Miles walks this landscape. He knows the risks. I won't lie to you. There are dangers in this landscape, but it's not something that a wall can. If there is somebody armed, that's Miles for them, and dangerous on this landscape, this border wall will do nothing to deter them. All it does is make it very hard for people in already very hard position to make it to somewhere where they think it'll be safer. That instinct I was talking about at the very beginning. How can you contain that instinct? It's inhuman to contain that instinct to begin with. And then it also hurts all the animals that move about this landscape. It creates problems with hydrology. It forces bears to climb the wall. Some of them fall. It makes it very difficult for others that simply can't cross. This little guy here, it's a javelina, wild pig from the southwest in many places in Mexico. Miles has been very thorough about this. There are some pictures here of him measuring the width of that. He knows the width of small mammal skulls in the region. He knows exactly what animal will be able to fit there. Because the skull is usually the widest part for some of these animals that adapt. And it's basically only mice that can make it through this. Some lizards. So yeah, check it out in your own time. And I'm very glad to support Miles and the people that are fighting this for anyway I can. Any other questions?
Does he put his own life at risk doing this?
In a manner, yes. And if you ask him, he wouldn't do it any other way. Which is I will say the things that put his life at risk are probably not, armed knives and things like that. It's probably more it's a dangerous landscape to operate. It's dry, it's hot, can be difficult. Any additional questions? Yes.
I have no expertise in the subject, so I'm just asking like an idea of top of my head. Just curious. Like I'm envisioning like a doggy board that is accessible for animals and not for humans. That's the main reason for the wall. Has there been any conversation about designing like the spaces where animals could fit through, or is that just been blocked in terms of conversation?
There have been discussions, there have been designs, there have been proposals, that's for sure. None of them address the systemic problem at the root of the issue, which is we don't need it. The wall should not even exist. The wall is an instance. And so as in the case of helicoptering jaguars into Arizona from Mexico, we have to ask ourselves, are we falling into a trap that perpetuates the root problems? I don't claim to have the answer. You know, I'm just throwing it out there that we have to be very mindful about how we address these things, because a Band-Aid won't fix a bleeding wound like that. There's another question somewhere here? Oh, yes.
Oh, so I'm from the borderline actually, and I know there's portions of the wall that were constructed on territory that's likely to be eroded or likely to shift, and I'm wondering what kind of impact the destruction before the destruction walls have on the wall.
Thank you for bringing that up, because another aspect of what Miles says that I totally forgot to tell you, documenting exactly this. The map that Miles put together identifies especially sensitive areas where erosion will result from how the wall and where the wall was constructed. So if you look at this map, in a GIS environment, and there's an online one that's very helpful, you will actually be able to see some of these places and get additional information on any of these locations. He's documented and presented a report that you can find on our website of all these different places and how they need to be restored, because exactly the kind of impact you're talking about. It's not just the wall. There's a huge road right next to it. It's a dirt wall that's used for vehicles from the border patrol to move from one place to another. And that road is built on very sensitive areas that erode very easily. And because they were rushing to get as much border wall done before Trump stepped down, they did a shoddy job at retaining the soil that they were moving about from one place to another. And there's lots of places where creeks have been filled with silt and are facing erosion, where vegetation was removed with no consideration of how that will impact on the huge monsoon rains in the summer. So all of that is happening. Our roadmap to address those issues is in that report, and hopefully somebody in this or the next administration will actually start investing in restoring these places because they're desperate for restoration. Did that answer your question? Yes, thank you. Over there.
Apologies if I missed it, you covered this, but about those wildlife vehicle creation programs, that's the remedy. You put ultrasonic things on every car or something.
Okay. Yes. Well, I'm glad you asked that. Wildlife crossings is a solution. Wildlife crossings are very simple infrastructures that are either bridges or tunnels under a highway that animals can use to cross it. How do they know where to cross? You're going to ask. Well, there is fencing. They call it sometimes funneling fencing. Fencing along the road where animals cannot actually access the paved part of the road. And so they have to walk about until they find a gap on the fence. And the gap happens to be exactly where you want to cross. And that is being built all over the United States. There's increasingly more money being allocated by the federal and state governments to build these structures in the United States. Mexico has to catch up, but we'll get there. And if you want to know more about the specifics of that, I would say contact Erin, and you wave your hand. She knows everything about funding for wildlife crossing government agencies, and in particular in Oregon, if you want to know about wildlife crossings where they're needed. Pauline, could you raise your hand? You can approach Pauline here. And if you want to know about the science of that, Ron has ample experience in them from North Carolina to California and different places. And of course, AHIGA here is monitoring their success rate in places where they've been placed in California. So there's a lot of expertise in the room if you want all the details. Yes.
Crossings were and are in place in Alaska, and we use them.
Yes. Yes. And in Canada, they've been building them in Banff for, I'm gonna say 2 decades now. And what's interesting is when they started studying, are they using? Like you said, are they using? They found that yes, they were using. But one interesting thing they found is that the first year, a few animals, the second year, it's enough. Third year, so on and so on. Animals learn to use these structures. It's not like an instinct that just triggers them, like I'm going to cross them. They can be frightened by the noise and the lights on the highway. But what's interesting is that cubs are learning from their moms. This is where I cross. And so they follow their mom and they go there then for the rest of their lives. When they're adults, they're going to cross that road exactly there. And they're going to teach their dogs where exactly to cross it. And so there's a learning curve for every one of these that you built. And it's important that research is sustained on them enough years if you're going to be able to prove their efficacy. And their efficacy is huge in terms of reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, a lot more than putting a sign that says, wildlife here, go slow. People will never make, they'll never slow down for one of those signs. It's actually been proven in multiple studies. One way I heard an expert describe this is people will drive at the speed for which the highway is designed, not the speed that is necessary. How many of us are guilty of that? It's like, I'll be the first to say, like, you drive at that. So the little moose silhouette there does nothing. Fencing and bridges and culverts need help. Yes.
I was just going to mention the inherent wildlife crossing of I-10 all along southern Louisiana. It's up above all the bayou, all the water under that there. You never see an alligator crossing the highway.
Yeah, exactly. We're finding a lot of common ground with builders in exactly where water is. It's the easiest way for them. They already have to build these structures for water to cross. And so with a little intervention, they can build them better so that they not only serve water flows, but also wildlife. There's definitely hope. Yes.
I think there's nitty-gritty on the thing, but I wonder if you could follow the predators with prey and then increase predation.
That's a question that's been asked, and there's been studies to try and find out. It doesn't seem to happen. The predators pass along, they do their thing, and then the prey pass along, and they do their thing. It might be happening in 1 or 2 instances, but it's certainly not a big issue in terms of taking care of the prey. And if they're eating, well, good for them.
Thank you for this incredibly moving
Oh.
presentation. You mentioned more federal money now to be doing work of many kinds. You mentioned and Secretary of Interior, who really is making it a priority to have place-based connectivity. It's a state priority. But in the time we have left in this administration, with a whole bunch of activists, where are you hoping for the most progress?
That is probably not a question. I'm not the policy expert in this room from our team. Erin, do you want to throw something out there?
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited, I think, with the progress that the Biden administration has made so far. I mean, we got $350 million from the infrastructure bill specifically for wildlife crossings, which is like, that's never happened before. And we're very excited about it. So we're working on making sure that it's implemented correctly, that it's going in the right places, and that we can have these success stories that we can package in themselves. So
permanent program that's funded further and funded beyond 5 years, right now, it's a pilot program. And then the BLM also issued an instructional memorandum just in November of last year. The habitat connectivity. I don't know if anybody's like worked with BLM for a long time, but they didn't have to do an analysis of their land. So that's pretty exciting that they're going to be doing that with the first assessment out later this year. I think, gosh, we always want to try and push legislation, but with the shift in Congress, I think that's going to be sort of rethinking things a little bit there. But I think we want to make sure that the stuff that's already happened is going to go well, that the agencies are going to embrace it and really buy into it, rather than just do something and do like the very minimum. So we're trying to work through some of the best little, I would say, like, just to make sure that we have a lot of time. Longevity.
Yes, other questions? Isn't it awesome to have a team here that's supporting you and they can address all the questions? Because ultimately, I can't be the expert. That's the whole point of this conversation. I can't be the expert of what moose need in Alaska and what policies are happening in Washington and whatever, you know. I try to tell the story of how it all connects, but having all these experts here is certainly very, very helpful. Yes.
So I'm curious. So you spoke, first of all, of course, thank you for an incredible and inspiring address here. And you spoke really beautifully about reimagining and a borderless land, and creating those connections, and helping lead people to just be able to imagine a different sort of world. What advice do you have or techniques do you use to help inspire that reimagination? Because I imagine some of those conversations have to.
Yeah, they're certainly difficult, and you don't start out by approaching someone and you need to imagine it differently, you know. That's celebrates, I guess. Breaking bread. That's the one thing, you know. We are building connections here. That's what we do as humans. A lot of our work is just, know them. You know, that rancher there that's spoiling that land is not really a bad guy. He just hasn't imagined it. This is what he grew up with. There are some nasty people out there, for sure. It's not a blanket statement that everybody has good intentions out there. There certainly are people. Or not, but only by breaking bread you realize, is this someone I can trust? Is this someone who will be moved by this story? And then listen to them. What is hurting for them? Try and address it and understand it, and gradually bring it up. You can plant a seed. Have you thought about it differently? Have you noticed this on the landscape? I've come across cowboys who didn't realize that cows were eating all the fresh shoots on a riparian. They were like, "Oh no, cows are fine. I mean, look at all these, what do you call them? Cottonwoods. Look at all these cottonwoods." Well, have you realized that there aren't any cottonwoods? It's all of these old cottonwoods, because your cows are really doing some damage on all the small ones. You start reflecting and looking at it. You're right, A few years later, we had a little enclosure around that particular riparian area that allowed for these, shoots to come out. So you have to be tactful about it. That'd be my recommendation, and work on the trusted listening first and foremost. Question over there. Intertwined. For the notes. Yes, I definitely believe that. Yes.
So, one day, hopefully, this board will.
It will.
And what does that process of restoring that kind of fragile landscape look like to you, as far as people, also like the partnerships that it's going to require? Because the damage that's been done is significant, and a lot of the work that it just seems like a lot of work, and I'm wondering what partnerships foster, if there's resources and connections that are already there, and what it looks like to you.
Yeah, like I said, We have a person on the ground documenting where it's needed most presently, most immediately. There are local groups like the Sky Island Lands and Borderlands Restoration Network who have the skill, the capacity, the technical knowledge to actually do the rest. Federal government said it would spend a lot of money in restoring this area. I don't know if any of that money has been spent. Maybe somebody else in this room might, but I certainly don't. I haven't heard that anyone has. And that would fall on the Army Corps of Engineers, is it? And so, you know, we need them on board to understand it's not just another engineering project, you know? And of course they know how to do restoration, but we have to share with them like these are the places that we're seeing. These are the people who can help you for the specifics of this landscape, etc., etc. That would definitely need to happen. It's an interesting question. In terms of how you go about doing it, I don't know. I'm not a restoration expert.
Averages that, like, and especially a lot of like desert lands, well, a lot of people see it as like dead, right? And I lived in Southern Nevada for, you know, almost 5 years, and it's very much not the case, you know, it's a thriving ecosystem. And do you feel like that buy-in is there from like Army Corps of Engineers and other, like, I mean, I'm sure that the wildlife groups and the advocacy groups understand it, but you think that buy-in is there to.
I think the Army Corps of Engineers understand water and arid lands. That's a broad concept and how that needs to be preserved and understands erosion in arid lands. The specifics and are they attached to and care for that landscape? I wouldn't know. I don't personally. I haven't personally interacted, so I wouldn't know. But there's definitely bias. The whole reason that one of the reasons that the border wall was allowed to report is that people think of this landscape as, you know, the hinterland of America. It's just a wasteland out there. We're trying to change that narrative, and I love how Miles talks about it when he says this is the heart of the Southwest. You know? And it's like, yes, this is the heartland because a lot of forces come together in that. There's biological influence from the Sierra Madre Occidental. There's a lot of tropical influence. A lot of species find their northern range, species that are thought of as tropical, such as jaguars, and ocelots, and frogs, and others. And also you have the influence of the Rocky Mountains. You know, and so that's a temperate, cold influence that gets the Chihuahuan desert coming in from the east, the Sonoran desert coming in from the west. All of that comes together and creates the only place in the land where you can find black bears coexisting with jaguars. You can find bald eagles with macaws, and things like that we wouldn't find else. So we have to change that narrative about how we think of these things. We have to tell a different story. And now you're imagining. Right? Any other questions?